What's up, everybody, and welcome to the universe of Kaiser Reich, where Germany wins World War I and the world gets very messed up as a result. Got a long video here for you today going over the entire history of Kaiser Reich up to when the game in Hoi 4 starts, so keep in mind that the lore is unfinished and continually updated. So if I get something wrong, it is definitely because it was, changed, and not at all because of my own incompetence. So sit back and enjoy as we pan the camera to the world stage, 1917. So the Entente, aka the Allies, as I will be referring to them for the rest of the video, this includes the British, France, Russia, Italy, Japan, Serbia, Belgium, Montenegro, Luxembourg, Najd, Hassa, Asir, Portugal, Romania, and Hejaz, have been battling the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire for 3 years now. So despite this apparent imbalance of power, a very large imbalance of power, mind you, I'll put a map up in the video because even without the US entering, it looks implausible for the Central Powers to win, but we are going to we are going to suspend our disbelief. Both sides are weak at this point in terms of munitions, material, morale, and men, but thankfully the grand country of America, the great bastion of liberty that separates the Atlantic and the Pacific, is on the horizon, coming to the rescue of our bloodied allied powers. Or is she? No, for in fact, neither the unrestricted German submarine warfare nor the infamous Zimmermann telegram materialize. And so the great war machine is never turned loose on these weakened Europeans. So, what exactly are all the differences from our timeline? Starting from the very first moment that this universe becomes twisted and different and pretty cool. So, starting off with the first Weltkrieg, also known as World War I, we're going to be going through just to give you a breakdown. We're going to be going through World War I here and then going through like all the post-war politics, and then that's it. So 2 sections there for you. Try to keep up. So differences from our timeline as well as some similarities. Firstly, unrestricted submarine warfare is not relaunched in January of 1917. Germany instead opts for submarine warfare under prize law rules. What are prize law rules? Prize law rules are when there's an agreement between nations that merchant ships cannot be attacked without warning and inspection of goods, and that if ships are destroyed, their crew must be relocated safely to another vessel. Vessels here don't include lifeboats. You can't Titanic them, although I would say that the Titanic does not fall under prize law rules, even if lifeboats were allowed. But this leads to the US not joining in on World War I in April as they did in our timeline. Keep in mind the US's incredibly capitalistic nature that compels them to protect their own trade, leading to their intervention in World War I in our timeline. In addition, their own geographic position and existence of the Royal Navy ensure that entering war is a safe move monetarily, meaning that Kaiser Reich has to create a very compelling reason for why the US does not enter war, which I believe they manage here so far only barely, but I really don't think they could do a lot else except for like drastically shake up the alliances that would cause the US not to enter the war, because as it stood in our timeline, very, very safe for the US to enter the war. They're not in danger of being attacked, and as we saw in World War II and also in World War I, it's very monetarily advantageous for the US to enter war away from its geographic borders. So, moving on to the 27th of August, 1917, the SS California, which is a British steamer, not an American one despite the name, is sunk when the submarine crew did not follow prize law rules. The current Chancellor of Germany decides to drastically limit submarine warfare as a result due to pressure from the US. At this point, the US should have been in the war for 4 months. Keep that in mind. Notably, the Battle of Cambrai happens just as it did in the original timeline, our timeline, with the appreciation of new tank, artillery, and aviation tactics due to an initial tactical victory by the British, even without American support. Of course, at this time, at the Battle of Cambrai, the Americans were supporting the British, and one of the reasons they won that battle, although I would argue the British still could have won it without them, but the reason for it happening, aka American support, isn't there in this universe, but it still happens. So I'll point little things out like this, and I don't mean to like rag too much because this mod is so cool and it's so fun to play, and the amount of skill to make something like this is insane. But when I notice things like that, I just have to point them out. And I'm going to be doing it again right here. So Russia capitulates on time in this universe as well. This doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Would the capitulation not have happened sooner? I find it hard to believe that a lack of US manpower and material begets no change in the Russian spirit to continue fighting. But moving on, the Eastern Front has collapsed, meaning Germany is free to move many men back to the west while also freeing Austria-Hungary up to focus on mowing poor Italy down. The Ludendorff offensive still occurs, even though the reason for it happening in our timeline is gone, which was the U.S. shipping men and supplies over, and Germany being like, oh crap, we kind of got to win this war pretty quick now. The next deviation from our timeline after the sinking of the SS California are the strike of the Parisian metal workers and other assorted laborers in June of 1918 that doesn't lead to anything right now except the spread of syndicalism among workers. However, if you know anything about Kaiserreich, this is but an inkling of what is to come. So the next deviation occurs when the Allied Great Western Offensive starts on the 8th of August in 1918. However, finally, something happens differently because of Americans. Without American support, the offensive does not do nearly as well as it did in our timeline. Of course, IRL, it reversed all of Germany's gains from the spring. Instead, the offensive is largely ineffective, draining the Allies of even more manpower while still leaving German salients in place. Very, very bad. This allows the Germans to continue shelling Paris. This is especially humiliating for France and leaves them in the worst position morale-wise they've been in the whole war. Except for the British forces, of course, consider it a strategic success because tanks were used successfully. Even though they couldn't have been that successful if the front line didn't move. What a great ally. I'm sure glad nothing bad will happen to the British. On September 4th, 1918, the British launched a spectacular failure of an offensive, the Sixth Battle of Ypres? Not sure how to say that. Not too worried about it either, leaving them in a bad spot morale and manpower-wise. But all is not well with the German Empire either. On the 24th of September 1918, German socialists rise up throughout the mainland proclaiming a socialist republic, although the revolution is put down by the end of October. This occurs roughly with the November Revolution Germany experienced in, well, November of 1918 in real life. This had larger repercussions than just a Red Scare. If you didn't know, the Soviets and Germans had a small post-war, for the Soviets, agreement called Operation Schleswig, or the German Bolshevik Supplementary Agreement, both in our timeline and Kaiserreich. This agreement started on the 27th of August and was essentially a collaboration that allowed the securing of Soviet railways in the north by Germany against potential White Army aggression, as the Russian Civil War was still very much raging. It didn't lead to very much in our timeline, as eventually the Western Front collapsed and Germany wasn't able to devote the necessary resources anymore, but in Kaiserreich, operations continued. Due to the events in September, several major telegrams in Germany were cut off, effectively ending communication between the Soviets and Berlin. Of course, the Soviets were like, what is happening? They didn't know what had happened and so believed the diplomatic ties were severed and feared a potential German invasion. Very scary and not nice to the Germans. But while war didn't break out, relations were majorly soured, more than they already were, as the Soviets really weren't a completely willing collaborator in Operation Schleswig. Anyways, the September Revolution snowballs even more deviations. The old, passive Chancellor of Germany resigns after their failure to stop the domestic crisis in a timely manner, or more importantly, prevent it altogether, and a new one, Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, is appointed. You can think of this man as a sort of Bismarck character, so he's not a socialist or a leftist or a liberal, but he implements a semi-parliamentary cabinet, meaning that liberal domestic political pressures ease up, further allowing a generally more militaristic government in Germany without backlash. So by militaristic government, I mean the de facto dictatorship of Ludendorff, the first quartermaster general and really the mastermind of the Eastern Front, and Hindenburg, the chief of the general staff, increasing in power while having the veneer of democracy. So these two guys were renowned again for their successes in the East and were highly influential at home because of it. Again, if you look at the West and you're a German, you're like, wow, those guys aren't doing crap. But in the East, they beat Germany or Russia, this like huge superpower, world-ending threat. Those guys must be pretty cool. So yeah, they were highly influential. Interestingly, this lore tidbit mentions democracy being important to project internationally, though I'm not entirely sure why, seeing as Germany's reputation on the world stage is already in tatters. Again, they have 3 allies in this war. People don't like Germany. So and democracy, like projecting that internationally, really wasn't a big deal until the post-World War II world. Keep in mind, even during World War I, like a lot of these countries were monarchies. Not that, I guess you can't beat them. We don't have to talk about it. But in our timeline in Kaiserreich, Britain had made significant advances into Ottoman territory, but by early October 1918, they fell back to Palestine as more men needed to be shipped to the Western Front and the British Protectorate of Egypt, as a revolution was on the horizon there. This Middle Eastern front rapidly turns from a more mobile war of encirclement and destruction into a war of attrition akin to the Western Front, and remains that way until the end of the war. On November 1st, 1918, Germany promotes unrestricted warfare yet again, due to wanting to placate the masses by promising a quick peace with the strangling of British shipping lanes, just as they did in our timeline, drawing the US in. How this doesn't lead to the US joining in on the war is unclear to me, but alas, they only cut off diplomatic relations with Germany. How Germany, being blockaded for almost 5 years now, hasn't succumbed in the war yet, but believes Britain will due to submarines, also baffles me. To be fair, Britain would have no overland shipping if they were subjected to unrestricted submarines for too long, while Germany had always retained some overland shipping, which does soften the blow. Anyways, Mehmed VI, I hope I'm saying that right, ruler of the Ottoman Empire, due to experiencing large anti-German sentiment and also anti-war sentiment, expels the three pashas, which, if you don't know what that is, that's the triumvirate that were put in power after a coup in 1913 and were the masterminds behind the Ottoman Empire joining the war, basically. So remember, like, even during this time, the Ottoman Empire was like the sick man in Europe, so why they would join in a war like this, where they're basically just being quadruple teamed, is insane. And it's up to these guys, basically. So this becomes essentially the sole executive power, Mehmed VI, that is. The Sultan also has a less friendly stance towards Germany, something that will be important after the war concludes and land starts being divided up, but is not important right now. But keep them back in your mind if you can. It's January 21st of 1919 now, and somehow the Irish War of Independence starts right on time. Even though you think it started a little bit earlier due to British incompetence on the Western Front, but it doesn't. Austria-Hungary also finally decides to do something besides be useless and commit to the final Austrian offensive in Italy, capturing Venice and encircling part of the Italian army. If you aren't aware of Italy's situation in World War I, they were already on the back foot 2 years ago when the Austro-Hungarians almost captured Venice and overran/encircled a large part of the army, crushing morale, losing Italy their Alpine defensive position, and forcing a replacement of the Italian military high command that was held responsible. At this point, while not explicitly mentioned, they must be close to being completely overrun, and I feel like Italy's pretty close to capitulating. Germany now launches a major offensive in March 16th of 1919, which initially goes far, even capturing Paris, but is pushed back by a well-timed tank-supported counterattack from the Allies that leaves only the town of Compiègne, Baguette, as a German gain. The British tried to push back against Germany at the Third Battle of the Somme on the 13th of April, but to no avail. Morale is low, especially among overseas colonial units, and the American flu, which is the Spanish flu, is ravaging the soldiers. This culminates in the Amritsar massacre on April 13th, 1919, remarkably well on time, yet again Kaiserreich, when the British regime in India, massacres pro-independence demonstrators, which is a precursor of things to come. On the 18th of May 1919, morale plummets to an all-time low on both sides as another offensive by the Allies is launched on the Western Front. No real ground is gained by Germany either because their troops refuse to commit to offensive actions. French troops also start striking on the front lines in tandem with the strikes in the armament factories back in the cities. They demand Clemenceau, the prime minister, to step down as well as calling for the end of the war. Pierre Monat is put into leadership of the CGT, which is a French pacifist syndicalist party. Thus starts the domestic war against the war in France. Very nice name, pretty cool. On the 2nd of June, Clemenceau steps down after losing a parliamentary majority, and Gaston d'Aumergue, a very similar type of leader in all honesty, is elected to prime minister and immediately begins more offensives and also does his best to break the strikes ravaging the country. On the small island of Malta, riots due to the high price of food are suppressed with deadly force by the British. This occurs on June 7th, 1919, the same day that it occurred in our timeline. Funny how this keeps happening. I won't stop picking on Kaiserreich for this. It's funny. Allied intelligence reports on the Western Front show no sign of a planned German offensive, and with strikes still rampant in France, the Allied leadership decides that it's now or never to finally break the German morale and end the war. The Lorraine Front is the chosen place of advance, as a successful operation there would mean a push all the way back to Alsace, heavily boosting Allied morale. Thus, on July 6, 1919, the attack commenced, unfortunately for the Allies. This offensive, like the last few, is completely ineffective, and now it appears as if the entire French army is in revolt due to the heavy casualties. Couple that with the general strike promoted by the CGT and the SFIO, which is the French Socialist Party, and the country is doomed. Despite vast amounts of repression, the people have spoken and the country is in a deadlock politically and militarily. It's over for France. On the 5th of August, 6 days after Ethiopia forcibly uncolonizes Eritrea, Italy signs an armistice with the Central Powers. Goodbye, Italy. You weren't very great, but you tried your best. As Austria moves to occupy Lombardy and Venetia, which is northern Italy, Italian socialists and nationalists rise up all over the country, waging a civil war against the waning Italian kingdom and the invading Austrians. A week later, the Allies come to the table with the Central Powers to sign an armistice. The war is over, well, except for, that pesky Japan. But the negotiations have just begun, and this is where it gets super fun. See you in the next part. Tajorek. Let's move on to the post-war period, except for Japan. In my script, I say let's lightning round the aftermath of the war here, but this is actually the longest part of the videos, and also the most confusing, so buckle down, or buckle in, or grab some snacks. Do something. In the West, France has to remove forts on the Belgian border, as well as deindustrializing its bordering province and allowing small amounts of land to be annexed by Germany. In addition to this, all French overseas holdings, with the exception of Algeria and the southern part of Western Africa, are bought by Germany. The wording on the wiki is a little confusing. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I don't know why Germany would buy these, because France was done. Anyways, and Morocco is also transferred to Germany as a protectorate. Belgium is made a German puppet in all but name, while also taking some French territory in compensation. They also cede the Belgian Congo to Berlin, forming the German puppet of Middle Africa, along with territories from Britain that is taken after the empire collapses, which is a little bit of a spoiler, but you're going to have to deal with it. This peace treaty launches a civil war in France that finds the communists the rulers of mainland France, while the old government and military command is forced to relocate to Corsica in Algeria. This exiled government becomes extremely autocratic, and rules over the African land with an iron fist, as unrest is understandably common. The takeover of communists in France scare the Swiss government, who fears their own internal rebellion, and the Swiss move to occupy Haute-Savoie, a neighboring province in France, leading to a crisis. Peace is negotiated through Germany. This opens the Germans up to recognizing France as the sole legitimate French state, as long as the Treaty of Versailles is still followed, which it is by the French communists. Due to the war being over, Germany seeks to demilitarize, and elections swing in the liberals' favor, allowing a coalition to be formed in parliament that elects Wilhelm Solf, the man who negotiated the treaty in France. He negotiated the treaty after he was elected. Sorry if that's a little bit confusing. Ludendorff, meanwhile, the wannabe dictator during the war. I know we talked about him a little bit, but after gaining all that fame and acclaim, him and Hindenburg basically had like that military dictatorship in Germany that I mentioned a little bit. But now German people are done, and so is the government. And Ludendorff is unceremoniously dismissed from power by Kaiser Wilhelm II after requesting emergency military powers. And overall, Germany looks like it's on the path to be a strong, politically liberal economic power, despite the continual crisis and repression its people received during the war. Too bad there's that small thing called Black Monday. Rest in peace, the German economy. But of course that happens after the game starts, so we need not concern ourselves with it too much. In Britain, the populace is unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles, which, while not harming the British, they're not really included in the treaty, it certainly didn't help them. The Irish and Indians had seceded already, and the country was in deep debt to the United States. This led to a revolt, and similarly to France, the old government and royal family evacuated to Canada, setting up a monarchy there for Canadians, while syndicalists took over the home island. India, Ireland, and the rest of the colonies and protectorates are freed, thus ending the British Empire. I say freed. It's a big word here and not all explanatory. That's the word they use in the wiki. I feel like it's more they lost the colonies than freed, especially, obviously with Ireland and India. But continuing on, unfortunately, we don't really know what happened to most of the colonies. Ireland won their War of Independence. India did something. In the game, they're like split three ways. It's kind of odd. For something like that to happen and there not to be lore, I'm pretty sure I'm missing something, but it's not really on the wiki. And in-game, it's not super explained. So it's a work in progress on some wiki pages, but on others, there's a supposed Sikh rebellion that happened, leading to the fracturing of the crown jewel of the empire. Ultimately, British control and desire for control, probably with them being syndicalists, collapsed after they took power, leading to the socialist revolution in the middle of India, and the monarchists take over in the south. You kind of have like that Hindi ethno-state kind of thing in the south. The middle is like communists. They're called like totalists. That's the path they go most of the time, which is kind of like your typical like Stalin communism. And the Northwest is still a Dominion, though they answer to Canada instead of Britain now, as you know, Britain is done being that kind of overlord role. Burma is also freed under an authoritarian democratic government, and if you thought there was a little information for Ireland and India, there was even less for the other colonies. Apparently, the Ottomans took some land where modern-day Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are. An Entente aligned, which is the monarchist bloc in the game. Union of South Africa is formed in the south, of course. While the French Republic took Malta and some African territories, leaving Middle Africa to take the rest. Argentina takes the Falklands, finally. Guatemala annexes Belize, and the West Indies Federation forms out of French and British Guiana, along with various islands. Australia, New Zealand, and Southern New Guinea form the Australasian Union, which is Entente aligned at the start of the game. Spain honestly isn't too different from the original timeline. Their major divergence point is when they start losing the war against the Republic of Rif in Morocco, which they did historically, but keep that in mind, they lost horribly for a long while. However, this time, France, due to them being communist, does not step in to aid their Spanish brothers, leaving Spain to get walloped by these insolent insurgents up until 1927, when Germany steps in instead. This causes major distress at home, boiling over into riots in major cities, as well as parliament. The prime minister is assassinated, just like our timeline, leading to the establishment of an unpopular liberal government with the new prime minister. A military coup followed, led by General Primo de Rivera. The king, Alfonso XIII, supported him. This led to an increase of military force in the Rif War, which still managed to be unsuccessful. While this was going on, Spain had thrown itself into the new German-led economic order with vigor, leading to an establishment of close ties between the two states. This led Germany to help in the Rif War, ending in 1927, a year later than the original timeline. Gibraltar was also conquered when the British Empire collapsed. General Rivera, that's 2 words by the way, had run out of military victories to bolster his popularity with the people, and so his government was doomed to fall. This compounded with the economic troubles that the Reichsbat, which was the German economic bloc that dominated the middle and eastern part of Europe, and the United States were experiencing. The right wing especially was dissatisfied with the government after the economic downturn, turning to the old Carlist, which was the previous monarchy, instead as a political base. This means that when the Civil War breaks out, it is not the two-sided affair that it is in our timeline, but instead a three-way war between the Syndicalists, the Carlists, and the status quo monarchists and the democracy. In Eastern Europe, the Bolsheviks are defeated due to the intervention of the German puppet states on the side of the whites. I should mention, after the war ends, Germany basically colonizes all of Eastern Europe, kind of like Soviet Union did after World War II. So that's kind of like their block there, and there's basically just a lot of puppets there, especially in Ukraine, and they form this thing called the Baltic Duchy. It's pretty cool. Cool. Anyways, these states intervene in the Russian Civil War, which is still going on at this time. This leads to the formation of the Russian Republic, because even though Germany supported the Soviets in World War I, their puppet states supported the White Russians after the war. Not really explained, I don't think. I couldn't find an explanation for that, but it's what happens. But if I had to guess, I would say that Germany didn't much like communists anyways, and now that the war was over, they can move troops over to liberalize their eastern neighbor. This is the weakest Russia has been in a long time, with the loss of the Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland, Belarus, the Caucasus, the area of modern-day Kazakhstan, and their Asia-Pacific holdings. This means that they will be seeking to expand their territory in the coming years, because they lost a lot of it. The Balkans are torn asunder, with Bulgaria enlarging through the annexation of Romania, Serbia, and Greek territory. Austria-Hungary is just really gross, and there isn't an explanation that I can find for it. They don't appear to have much more land than they started with, but between World War I and World War II, or the second Will Creek that's going to happen in the future after the game start, they've become this awful thing in game. They're super unstable, so I'd assume that there are a lot of insurgent nationalists in there somewhere, and this play of splitting up like this was to dampen those sentiments. Apparently, Illyria, Galicia, and Lodomeria and Bohemia are secondary constituents of the dual monarchy, while Austria and Hungary are the primary constituents. Not sure what to do with this information, but there you go. Serbia cedes some land to Austria, but merges with Montenegro, so kind of a give and take for Serbia, even though they did like start the war and also got beaten pretty profoundly. The current monarchy in Serbia is held in place, but a pro-Austrian government is elected, and Serbia is forced to pay war reparations, so they're essentially a puppet to the dual monarchy at this point. Italy, as previously mentioned, fell into civil war after the Weltkrieg ended. The socialists in the northeast fought against Austrian-backed capitalists in the northwest, while also defending in the south against the Papal States and what remained of the monarchy. Eventually, the war was over, and a peace was brokered. Socialist Italy was allowed to remain in the northeast, while the rest of the capitalist states, those being the Italian Republic, the Papal States, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and Sardinia, were combined into a federation that was backed by the Austro-Hungarians. What would the poor socialists do against such reckless hatred? Fortunately for them, the British Empire collapsed in 1926, which added a new syndicalist nation to the International. The Internationale. The Third Internationale is a socialist bloc in Kaiserreich. This gave them the boost they needed, and an attack against the southern part of the Federation was started. Coincidentally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in a state of turmoil, when weren't they? And so they withdrew protection from the Federation, deeming it too costly. This led to the Federation dissolving and the current borders in Italy established and ready for the Second Weltkrieg, which I guess if you're not paying attention to the video, essentially you have the Northeast Socialists, you have the Republic of Italy up in the north, or Socialists in the northwest, Republic of Italy in the northeast, Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the south, and Papal States in the middle there. Also Sardinia is alone. In the Caucasus, Ottoman and German interests clashed. Despite the Ottomans fighting the war on the side of the Central Powers, they had separate and competing interests in comparison to the other Central Powers. They had already ceded any claims in the Balkans, as Bulgaria was a Central Power and its territorial expansion had already been recognized. This left the Caucasus as the last place the Ottomans had left to expand, as well as a front that they had won and fought in entirely on their own. So they're like, we deserve this, right? Germany wanted the Baku oil fields in Azerbaijan, as well as support connections from Georgia to Ukraine. Facing internal revolt, the Ottomans were forced to accept these claims because they couldn't possibly fight a war against Germany and win, right? But they were allowed to annex the Armenian Republic in compensation. Out of the three Caucasian republics, two of them were German puppets and the others ceased to exist under Ottoman rule. In effect, the Ottomans gained very little out of the war, Armenia and land in the modern-day lands of Qatar and the UAE being their only gains, with a large amount of internal strife present. Cairo Pact, anyone? It's like, it was an inside joke you probably don't understand. Let's rest on that fact. No, I'm kidding. So the Cairo Pact is like, everybody that the Ottomans control is pretty mad, especially Egypt, which is why it's named for Cairo, and they all attack them. This is in the game, so it's a potential factor in the Ottomans' future. They also lost Yemen, southeast portions of the Arabian Peninsula to rebels, and the formation of a type of international collective ownership in the Levant. So the Ottomans are left in a very precarious position on the world stage. In the east, Japan has to revert to pre-war territory, despite its occupation of German, formerly French Asian colonies when they signed the Tsingtao Accord on November 6, 1921. However, they are given the right to rule over Manchuria and their other colonialist projects, like Korea and Taiwan. Though not coming into the war too damaged, morale is definitely low at home, and with France falling, the unexpected post-war economic boom is yet to happen. In fact, the opposite seems to be occurring. After anarchists failed to assassinate Prince Regent Hirohito, the country was forced into a state of martial law. Army Minister General Tanaka Gichi is a historically appointed prime minister in 1923, splitting the country in two, with Tanaka's opposition coming out ahead. They're more popular even though Tanaka is the prime minister. However, with his newfound power, the prime minister enforces a peace preservation law, which calls for the deaths of those who oppose the national polity. Very draconian. When the Japanese got hit with the old double whammy, which is the British Empire's collapse and the Reichspot plus the US economic death spiral, their economy goes down the toilet in tandem, exposing Tanaka's ineffectual rule. This is also coupled with German consolidation in China, as well as China being very, very against Japan. So Japan's not looking too great. This leads to a coalition forming between the two main opposition parties, the Rikken Seiyuki and the Kensaikai. I'm so sorry. Causing Tanaka's cabinet to resign over mounting pressure. This leads to a comparatively liberal government being put in power, though with their eyes still on dominating China and expelling the ailing Germany from Asia. At this time, Germany is ailing. Also, Emperor Taisho has died, leaving Hirohito as the new emperor. Oh boy, time to talk about China. Let me tell you, China, they have an insane amount of lore in Kaiserreich and in real life. We just call that history in real life, by the way. Didn't know if you knew that. I could make like a whole video on these guys, and if I talked about them fully, it would be like half this one. So we're gonna save it for a later date. I'm still gonna talk about them, but not as in depth as some of the other easier to explain nations. But let's start. So for this, we're going to have to go back to late 1914. Unfortunately, the timeline recount I did earlier was a very Western Front focused. This makes sense as the history in universe is written by the victors, Germany, who definitely didn't go adventuring in Asia. Like the wiki is written as if they're in the Kaiserreich. Some parts of it are. So it didn't really account for China's mess. In late 1914, the Weltkrieg kicks off and Japan annexes the German Kaishu Bay Concession, which was a German colony in China that was established in mimicry of the British Empire. So keep in mind at this time, the Germans seek to establish a navy as large as the British, meaning they needed a large foreign base to supply the parts and resources. An empire large enough to rival India, basically. Also keep in mind that this kind of gave Germany like a justification for the navy they were building, as they weren't like war hadn't happened yet. So got to keep those costs up for something, right? So China isn't too happy about this, obviously, but there's not much that they can do, being China. Japan then sends them a list of 21 demands, which for the most part is rejected. However, the part that is accepted by Yuan Shikai, head of the government, is deeply unpopular with the Chinese public, who are already boycotting Japanese goods, like just on their own. So anti-Japanese sentiment very high, but Yuan has other plans. Soon Japan will become irrelevant. His plans are domestic. He wants to become the emperor and restore a monarchical rule that had just been overthrown in favor of a republic a few years prior. And so he does in 1915, setting off the National Protection War, just like in our timeline. The southern provinces in China were the most upset about this, being the furthest from Beijing, among many other reasons. This war is short, and in 1916, Yuan abdicates. He lost the war, as pressure from the southern states and Japan was mounting. Li Yuanhong is appointed president. All is well, right? Of course it's not. Unfortunately, the state of China is decentralized and too far gone now to reclaim its territory. Local rulers spring up in abundance. Importantly, factionalism in the government is at an all-time high, and China decides not to join the war on the Allies' side as they had in our timeline. It's 1917 now, and Li has stepped down from his presidency, leading Premier Duan to be the new de facto leader, even though the old vice president is technically the leader. Duan courts opinion with the military and ends up abolishing parliament as well. Disagreeing with these actions, parliamentarians and dissatisfied opportunistic generals and warlords spring up in the south. This leads to the Constitutional Protection War /movement. Duan is deeply embarrassed and steps down when various generals in his army refuse to fight the Southerners, despite him, backing them. This leads to a temporary armistice in the winter. It doesn't last for long, and soon enough, political pressure is put upon President Feng Gaosheng that Duan is reinstated as premier and the war is restarted. After a major northern victory, the commanders once again refuse to push onwards and instead try to talk peace with Sun Yat-sen, the southern leader. Sun refuses to talk and is ousted by his own generals. Peace is established once again through various back channels, and China is united. Duan and the president both resign, as they're in the Anfu clubs, which is their high-ranking supporters. Support is waning. However, Duan still has some influence and convinces Zhu Shuzheng, a major general, to initiate an invasion of Mongolia. And there's the dog. Which might seem a tad odd to you. As less than a year ago, China was embroiled in civil war. Why would they want more territory that they might not be able to control? Well, the United States wishes to form an arms embargo against China in order to protect the empire from fracturing again, while the Germans are engaging in diplomatic plays to limit Japanese influence in China. This all means that large demilitarization is coming to East Asia and China more specifically, whether they want it or not. And Duan and the Anfu Club is supported by Japan, who want to get ahead on the territory grabs before they become an object of the international status quo. Additionally, Russia is in a civil war and in not any way able to protect Mongolia from invasion. Fast forwarding, this blew up in Duan's face as documents were leaked from Germany proving that Duan promised Japan that they would give them land concessions, most notably Germany's legation in exchange for loans. Uprisings occur everywhere against the Anhui clique, which is Duan's personal power base and different from the Anfu Club, and the Anhui clique is destroyed in this war. Duan flees to the Japanese concession, and so ends that conflict and the start of 1,000 new ones. I could continue into more detail here, but I think we've gone on long enough, so I'll try to wrap it up. Keep in mind, we're now in like the warlord era and like Kaiserreich and in our timeline, which gets very, very messy and very hard to explain and describe because most people don't have like a foundational understanding of what it is or who the characters are, which makes it difficult to make like a little brief review over because you're going to be learning a lot of names, and that's kind of difficult. Moving on, Sun Yat-sen, again, who was the leader in the South at the time of that civil war, reestablishes his power by forming the Kuomintang in the South, which in our timeline is basically the faction that gets kicked out to Taiwan after they lose the civil war against the communists, and he sets up a rival government to oppose the North. The second Guangxi-Guangdong War never happens, which is between two southern cliques. Cliques are kind of like they're independent states, but they're still like Chinese essentially. So that war never happens, as the German occupation of French colonies makes the Chinese fear that a foreign intervention might occur if a war did start like that. And while Sun Yat-sen does his best to unite the South through war, there are quite a lot of cliques that refuse to give up power to the Guangdong clique, and this war was essentially an expanding of Sun's power in the South, but it never happens, and so the South is weakened by the independent warlords. Meanwhile, Mongolia is entirely subjugated under White Russian control. The war is now officially over, with Japan signing the Tsingtao Accord, the World War I that is, that relinquishes all Japanese gained territory in exchange for recognition of their extraterritorial interests, which we already mentioned before, like Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan. And I could continue describing Chinese warlordism forever, as we're only in 1922 and we have 14 more years to get to game start. However, I am not experienced in interwar Chinese history, and to be honest, I could dedicate a whole video to just the Chinese situation, so I'll skip forward to look at the Chinese situation when you enter the game for the sake of brevity and my own sanity. Additionally, the lore starts to get like really threadbare right around when it starts to get important, from 1921 to 36. So essentially, China is now extremely fractured into various cliques. I already explained what those were. The most powerful among these being the Qing government and the League of Eight Provinces. Most of the cliques are nominally friendly to each other, with the exception of Liangguang and the League. The appearance of the legation cities, which are all these colonial treaty ports that the Hoi For mod basically just puts under like one banner, says you are a government now, on Chinese coast, is a clear indication of their domination by foreign powers, the most notable being Germany, with their East Asian concessions in Shandong and their occupation of Indochina. Japan also exerts considerable influence in Manchuria, now known as the Fengshan government. This is a country that lays claim to the vision of a Chinese republic by presenting a thin veneer of democracy. So all in all, China is incredibly fractured and torn apart by various foreign powers, meaning that they will most likely never form a united China, TM, or asterisk, or just think about it, like the one formed after World War II in our timeline. Moving on to South America, let's take a look at the Argentinian nation that is split between the syndicalist Patagonian Workers Front to the south and the fascist Argentina to the north. I should say authoritarian, I don't think they're actual populace, but I'm going to use that word anyways. You're going to have to deal with it. With war on the horizon, let's take a look at how this split occurred. Since the 1870s, Argentina had been a regional industrial powerhouse, and while despite appearing as a relatively satisfactory democracy, the anarchist undercurrent was ever present in the urban factory workers. The population's political shift to the left only grew with each passing year, as the country continued to industrialize, drawing significant amounts of foreign workers who were promised a stable living and high wages. The wiki says that anywhere from 50 to 70% of the male working class were immigrants, mostly European. Since immigrants did not have voting rights, it became increasingly militant in their leftism, and it seems like a matter of time until the Argentinian state buckled under the anarchist workers. In 1902, the true tyranny of the state was revealed when a general strike occurred and it was subsequently repressed by the state. This was followed by a large demonstration in Buenos Aires in 1904 that was also violently pulled down. These workers' marches were the catalyst for general anti-foreign discrimination and indiscriminate deportations of leftists. Couple this with the de-radicalization of the most popular union, that being CORA or CORA, which was becoming more favorable and willing to negotiate with employers, and the anarchist dreams were all but shattered by the start of World War I. The FORA, or the FORA, the more radical workers group, was left destitute as a consequence, further crushing the dreams of the left. But all was not lost for the anarchists. As Britain slowly came to the realization that World War I would not be a war that could be won, their companies started to squeeze as much as they could out of their Argentinian holdings. This incited a few industry-specific strikes between 1918 and 1919, eventually culminating in a huge far-right reaction that had pogroms occurring in working-class neighborhoods, killing thousands and quelling any hope of anarchism in the north. Inner Patagonia. Anarchists from abroad and northern Argentinians flooded into Patagonia as a place of refuge and wages. Dissatisfied with their continually dwindling wages herding sheep, they instituted a general strike that, after a few months of negotiating with the ranchers and the Argentinian government, broke out into full rebellion. The government was pushed out of the region with the help of a lot of bodies and some French weapons, and the bridges across the Rio Negro were destroyed, leaving Patagonia safe for the time being. Since they were blockaded by the Navy, the new nation turned to Chile for help. Chile ended up helping them, hoping that in time Patagonia would turn into a Chilean puppet, or even better, fully annexing into the nation. This help given to the Patagonians was at first born of an anti-Argentinian pragmatism, but it later grew into a shared political struggle as Chile flipped to the syndicalists after their bankruptcy in 1931. Apologies for the long time spent on the PWF relative to their size, but I really enjoy their rather extensive history for Kaiserreich. Also, a little tidbit, Joseph Stalin was sent over to the Argentinian side when the PWF was receiving French aid, which is pretty interesting. It's the Argentinian side, he was in the Patagonian side, my bad. Anyways, Brazil in Kaiserreich is very much a counterweight to the revolutionaries down south. They stayed out of World War I, unlike our timeline, due to economic concerns that a large war would cripple their coffee and rubber export-focused economy. And while the war didn't cripple them, the promise of an economic upturn after the end of it shattered their optimism. This led to small revolts, both left and right-wing, as well as splitting between the bourgeoisie that had previously controlled the elections, the so-called milk and coffee politics. In 1927, an aristocratic rebellion was sparked as their coffee split with the milk, and the rebels won, which was coffee. Since then, 2 whole presidents have been elected democratically, though political tensions are still high. And that's where Brazil is left when the player picks a game up. Honestly, not too bad of a start, although it could use some industrializing. Paraguay is in a bad state after winning the Chaco War, which caused it to halve its population. Additionally, given its authoritarian rule, the revolutionaries down southwest certainly give it pause, while the only other illiberal regime next door, Bolivia, being none too friendly given the previously mentioned war, and Paraguay ain't looking so hot domestically or internationally. Venezuela, Colombia, and Uruguay are all social democracies, though there isn't much to them in regards to the lore. Peru is also lacking in lore, but it is authoritarian, giving Paraguay a potential ally. Ecuador is also democracy like Brazil. Moving north, Panama hasn't changed from our timeline. That is, they have an oligarchic democracy. Costa Rica is also unchanged. They have a more regular democracy, but are faced with a ruptured economy due to the decrease in profitability of bananas. Aww. Nicaragua has turned syndicalist after the brave and inconceivable revolution of Cesar Augustus Sandino against a U.S.-backed democracy in the style of our timeline's Castro. Honduras is ruled by a military dictatorship, although most of the country is de facto leaderless. This is after the Honduran peasants revolted against the U.S. fruit companies that were taking over the nation politically and economically. El Salvador is the same as in our timeline, that is fascist. Guatemala, after trying to overthrow its fruity U.S. oppressors, fell to a fascist regime and then gobbled up Belize after the British Empire fell. If I could name a common theme, and the reason I spent so much time in Central America, the common theme present in Central America is that because the U.S. did not start their path towards being the world police that they became after World War I, but especially after World War II, in our timeline, these countries were more able to overthrow unwanted U.S. hegemony, with these revolts having varying degrees of success. To discuss why Mexico is now a syndicalist government, we have to rewind the clock to 1916, just before the divergence point. Mexico had just finished their 6-year civil war, also known as the Mexican Revolution, and Carranza is a new president. Though he is struggling with both a large political and legal opposition, as well as agrarian revolutionaries in the south, Zapata, the leader of the rebels in the south, was supposed to have been taken care of by Colonel Guajardo, until Guajardo defected to Zapata's side, taking all his men and equipment with him. This is where Kaiserreich diverges from our timeline. Because Zapata remains in power when the new president is elected, they decide to form a joint government with the Zapatistas, officially ending armed rebellion in Mexico. Later on, after returning from helping the Nicaraguan revolutionaries beat the U.S. Marines, Zapata runs for president in 1913. He's running basically on agrarian land reform, which is why they started revolting in the first place. This leads Mexico to implement... He wins. Sorry. And this leads Mexico to implement large amounts of land reform, as well as seeking an alliance with the European syndicalists, seeing as they had a now potentially hostile U.S. to their north. And finally, the capstone, what everyone has been waiting for, the United States of America. Well, not to spoil anything, but they aren't quite the giant that they became in our timeline. After staying neutral in the war, and watching the Entente lose the Great War, America still managed to have a roaring 20s through the McAdoo administration. It was cut short by the early start of the Great Depression due to the collapse of the British Empire, who had accrued a significant American loans that were now null, as well as being a major trading partner for America. Couple this with the collapse of the French a few years earlier, and the overseas trade had basically collapsed for the US. Additionally, Germany had economic dominance over the rest of Europe and swaths of Africa and Asia. All of this spelled doom for the US economy. Hoover was elected in 1928, just like in our timeline, and just like in our timeline, completely failed to reverse the Great Depression. This leads into the US's situation in 1936, one of economic downturn, political instability, and a general feeling of doom. Thankfully, the economic downturn can be reversed with a couple focuses, Hoi 4 style. I was getting worried there. Honestly, the US's pre-1936 situation isn't very interesting, just like on paper, like what we have in the lore. It's what happens afterwards, aka the potentially four-way civil war, that makes for a great story and one that I hope to tell in a future video. So if you'd like to see that, subscribe. Alright, the conclusion. You watched all the way through the video. Thanks. That's the complete history of Kaiserreich in one video. I will say that I know I left out some small bits and bobs. I'm sorry I didn't cover like the Alash autonomy or something like that, but it was either because they were mostly irrelevant or because there wasn't really enough information on the wiki or in-game to cover it. Think about basically what I did in Central America. I did that because I wanted to show how the US had like not become the world police that they did in our timeline, but going over small country number 3, nothing changes, moving on, like that's pretty boring, so I left it out. If you have any suggestions for like major things I missed, again, I mentioned I like to do videos once the game starts, like going through all the different paths that you could take. I'll also like to do one on China just because they're like so huge and that'd be crazy. But yeah, so if you have any suggestions for major things I miss, again, I will never cover the Alash autonomy. I'm sorry. If you'd like anything to be in the video, leave it in the comments. Tell me what you thought. I hope you had a good time. If you're already here, unless you're like hate watching, you should subscribe because I had a lot of fun making this and it's something I'd like to do more. Adios.